Have you ever listened to an official statement and just had that feeling that you're not getting the whole story? That the words being used are so carefully chosen they mean something completely different from what they say? Well, you're not wrong. That is the language of power, and it's a fascinating and often deliberately confusing world. And today, we're going to decode it. And really, there is no better place to start than with George Orwell. This quote right here, it's the key to this whole thing. The point of so much political language isn't just to be polite, it's to literally disconnect words from their real and often very brutal meanings. It's a way to talk about terrible things without making us actually picture them. So, to understand how this works on a massive scale, we need a solid framework. And probably the most influential one comes from Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's landmark book, Manufacturing Consent. It's a really powerful theory about how the media in a democracy can end up acting like propaganda, but without anyone ever giving a direct order. Now, what's so interesting here is how it's supposed to work. This isn't about some government censor standing over a journalist's shoulder. No, the theory argues that because the biggest media outlets are huge, for-profit corporations, their very structure creates a natural bias. They end up relying on things like market forces and even self-censorship to push a narrative that, well, supports the existing system. So how does that actually happen? Well, Chomsky and Herman laid out this model with 5 filters that any piece of news has to pass through before it ever gets to you and me. You can almost picture it like a series of sieves, where each one strains out some of the more inconvenient truths. Let's break these down real quick. First up, ownership. Media companies are massive corporations, usually owned by very wealthy people, so it makes sense that the news would tend to reflect their interests. Then you've got advertising. The real customers for a news outlet aren't us, the viewers, it's the advertisers paying the bills. So news that might upset those advertisers is just bad for business. Third is sourcing. Media outlets rely heavily on official sources from the government and big corporations because it's easy, cheap, and it sounds credible. But that gives those powerful institutions a huge say in what becomes news. Fourth, there's flack. This is basically organized pushback. Think lawsuits or PR campaigns from powerful groups designed to discipline the media. And finally, number 5, creating a common enemy. Think the war on terror or historic anti-communism. It's an incredibly effective tool for rallying public support and pushing anyone who disagrees to the margins. Put it all together, and the news you get has already been shaped and filtered long before you see it. Okay, so that's the big picture system that filters our news. Now let's zoom in and look at the specific tools used by the officials who are so often the sources for that news, the actual language they use to sell us their policies and actions. And at the very heart of this toolkit is the euphemism. It's a simple idea, really. Make something that's pretty unpleasant sound neutral, or heck, even positive. It's the art of putting lipstick on a pig. And once you start looking for euphemisms, you will see them absolutely everywhere. So let's see how this actually works in the real world with some pretty powerful examples. This is where all that theory gets very, very real. Here's a famous one. After 9/11, the US government needed a way to talk about methods like waterboarding without actually using the word torture, which is, illegal and pretty universally condemned. The solution? Enhanced interrogation techniques. It sounds so clinical, so technical, and it completely masks the brutal reality of what was actually being done. This one is a military classic. Collateral damage is a term that transforms the killing of innocent men, women, and children into a sterile, almost bureaucratic accident. It lets officials acknowledge the people died without conveying any of the human tragedy. It literally turns people into abstract damage. This one is all about grammar. Officer-involved shooting uses what's called the passive voice. It removes the person who did the action, the officer who pulled the trigger, and it makes it sound like something that just happened. It's a way of obscuring responsibility. In fact, it's become so well known as a misleading euphemism that a lot of news organizations are now actively trying to avoid it. And hey, it's not always about war and violence. Look at economics. Revenue enhancement became a super popular way to talk about raising taxes back in the 1980s. I mean, who could possibly be against enhancing something? It's a brilliant way to frame taking more of your money as a positive thing for the government. And here's a very recent example. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine was officially called a special military operation. That framing was absolutely crucial for their domestic audience, suggesting something limited, precise, and justified, instead of what it actually was, a full-scale war. So we've seen how euphemisms can soften policies and hide violence.
But what happens when this kind of language is used to make the truly, truly unthinkable seem plausible? Well, that brings us to what might be the ultimate example. The very idea of a limited nuclear war, or LWO, sounds like a total contradiction, right? But in some strategic circles, it's a very real concept, and it's built almost entirely on the power of language to manage our perception of, well, the apocalypse. Just listen to the words in that definition. Low yield, limited number, limited objectives, small space. Every single word there is designed to reassure us, to suggest that this is something that can be controlled, contained, and managed, not like an all-out nuclear holocaust. Now, this chart shows you what low yield actually means. On the far left, you see the explosive power of a massive conventional bomb. Now look at the range for a so-called low-yield nuke. It's way, way more powerful. But the term low yield does this linguistic trick. It shrinks that gap in our minds, making it feel closer to something we already understand. And to make the whole idea even more acceptable, strategists talk about using a so-called clean bomb. This is a weapon that's designed to produce less radioactive fallout. The language suggests a nuclear strike could somehow be discriminate, proportional, maybe even compliant with humanitarian law, all of which makes the terrifying decision to cross that nuclear line just a little bit easier. So when is a limited nuclear war actually considered possible? Well, according to strategic theory, you need 3 conditions to all be true at once. First, you need a goal you just can't achieve any other way. Second, you need a whole range of nuclear weapons to deter an all-out response. And third, you have to create enough psychological leverage to make your opponent back down. As you can see on this diagram, that space in the middle where all 3 overlap, the space where LNW is possible, is incredibly small and unbelievably dangerous. And here's the most important point. The entire concept of a limited nuclear war is an exercise in language. It uses a whole series of carefully chosen euphemisms to take an event of unimaginable horror and frame it as a rational, manageable, and maybe even winnable policy choice. It's all about making the unthinkable sound strategic. And that brings us right back to where we started. From collateral damage all the way to a limited apocalypse, the language of power is designed to shape our reality. And it leaves us with a really critical question. If the words we hear from people in power are so often just a veil, what other truths are they hiding? What's the real story we aren't being told?